Welcome back to Ethos Trek. I'm Sarah, and today we're looking in a mirror that most people would rather not face. In our last episode, we examined the psychology of collective narcissism, the research-backed framework for understanding how people become emotionally invested in an inflated belief about their group's greatness, and what that investment predicts. Hypersensitivity to threat, defensive aggression, collective entitlement, and attraction to charismatic, quote, mirror, unquote, leaders. Today, we're going to look at what happens when that psychology is systematically, deliberately weaponized. We're going to examine the Hitler Youth. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about why we're doing this. It's not for shock value. It's not to call anyone a Nazi. It's because understanding how radicalization happened before gives us the tools to recognize and resist when it's happening now. The Nazis didn't invent collective narcissism. They discovered how to exploit it at an industrial scale. And the playbook they wrote is still being used today. The scope of the project. Let's start with the scale of what happened. In January of 1933, when Hitler came to power, the Hitler Youth had approximately 100,000 members. By the end of that year, 12 months, membership had increased to over 2 million. By 1936, membership exceeded 5.4 million. In 1939, it became mandatory, and competing youth organizations were dissolved or banned. Think about that rate of growth. That's not organic enthusiasm. That's systematic recruitment and indoctrination. A 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined this indoctrination using modern survey data. Researchers found that Germans who grew up under the Nazi regime, who went through Nazi schooling and Hitler Youth programs, are significantly more anti-Semitic than those born before or after that period. The share of, quote, committed anti-Semites, unquote, among those cohorts is 2 to 3 times higher than in the general population. 80 years later, the effects are still measurable. That's how powerful systematic indoctrination is. The playbook. Breaking down the family. The Nazi regime understood something crucial. Families, private cohesive units with their own values, were obstacles to total ideological control. Hitler himself said it explicitly. Let me quote from a 1938 speech. Quote, "These boys and girls enter our organizations at 10 years of age, and often, for the first time, get a little fresh air. After 4 years of the young folk, they go on to the Hitler Youth, where we have them for another 4 years. And whatever class consciousness or social status might still be left is taken over by the labor service and smoothed out there," unquote. Notice what he's describing. A conveyor belt that captures children and processes them for over a decade, deliberately overriding family influence at each stage. The Hitler Youth wasn't just an after-school program. It dominated children's lives. Members had to attend regular meetings, camps, and events. The time commitment was designed to be so consuming that family time and family values became secondary. And here's the darkest part. Some Hitler Youth members were encouraged to inform on their own parents. Children denounced mothers and fathers who expressed doubts about the regime. The family unit, the primary buffer between the individual and the state, was deliberately fractured. Cultivating collective narcissism. Now let's examine how the Hitler Youth systematically cultivated each pillar of collective narcissism we discussed in Episode 1. Pillar 1. Hypersensitivity to perceived threats. Nazi propaganda constructed a world where the German Volk was under constant siege. The humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, the, quote, stab in the back, unquote, myth, the lie that Germany hadn't really lost World War I, but had been betrayed by internal enemies. The economic devastation blamed on Jewish financiers. The, quote, Bolshevik threat, unquote, from the East. Children were taught that enemies surrounded them, that their very existence as Germans was threatened. Textbooks, children's books, games, and songs all reinforced this siege mentality. One famous children's book, Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, taught children to identify Jews the way you'd identify a poisonous fungus. The message? Danger is everywhere, hidden, waiting to harm you. You must be vigilant. Pillar 2. Intergroup aggression as defense. Once children were trained to see threats everywhere, aggression became self-defense. Hitler Youth activities included paramilitary training, weapons familiarization, assault courses, basic combat tactics. This wasn't incidental. The stated goal was to produce, quote, race-conscious, obedient, self-sacrificing Germans who would be willing to die for Führer and fatherland, unquote. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jewish teachers were fired, and Hitler Youth members, trained to see Jews as existential threats, would wait outside Jewish schools and beat students as they left. This violence was framed as defensive, protecting Germany from its enemies. The aggressors saw themselves as victims fighting back. Pillar 3. Self-entitlement as collective destiny. The Nazi curriculum was built around the idea of inherent racial superiority. Germans weren't just one nation among many. They were the master race, the Herrenvolk, destined to rule. The official Hitler Youth Handbook devoted 45 of its 105 pages to racial ideology. This entitlement was presented as scientific fact, historical destiny, and moral truth all at once. Young people were taught that their superiority wasn't something they had to earn. It was inherent in their blood, their biology, their Germanness. And if other races didn't recognize that superiority, it was because they were either inferior themselves or part of a conspiracy to suppress the rightful rulers of the world. Pillar 4. The mirror-focused charismatic leader. And then there was Hitler himself. His portrait hung in every classroom. Textbooks described the thrill of seeing the Führer in person. Children were taught that Hitler embodied Germany itself, that he and the nation were inseparable. Alphonse Heck, who rose to a high position in the Hitler Youth, later described his indoctrination. Quote, I belong to Adolf Hitler, body and soul, unquote. Not to Germany, to Hitler personally. The leader and the group identity had fused completely. That's what collective narcissism researchers describe as identity fusion with a mirror leader. Attacks on Hitler were experienced as personal attacks on every German. His grievances became their grievances. His enemies became their enemies. The subtle mechanism. Here's something crucial from the historical record. Many survivors describe the indoctrination as subtle. Peter, who was enrolled in a special Hitler boarding school at age 6, later became a historian of Nazi Germany. He described the process as gradual, almost invisible. It took him 2 years after the war had ended to come to terms with the atrocities Germany had committed, a process he called, quote, very painful, unquote. The researcher Alphonse Heck put it this way, quote, we 5- and 6-year-olds were systematically manipulated without our knowing it, unquote. At the time, it didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like truth, like the natural way to see the world. This is how radicalization works. It doesn't feel radical from the inside. It feels like waking up to reality. The persistence of indoctrination. The 2015 study I mentioned earlier found something else remarkable. Nazi indoctrination was most effective where it could tap into pre-existing prejudices. Germans who grew up in districts that had supported anti-Semitic parties before 1914, before the Nazi era even began, showed the greatest increases in anti-Jewish attitudes after Nazi schooling. In other words, the Nazis didn't create prejudice from nothing. They identified existing grievances, existing resentments, existing fears, and they amplified them, organized them, gave them a target and a purpose. As one former Hitler Youth member put it, quote, we were born into Nazism, never had a chance unless our parents were brave enough to resist the tide and transmit their opposition to their children, unquote. Critical thinking questions. Question 1. How do we draw comparisons without trivializing the Holocaust? This is essential. The Holocaust was unique in its industrial-scale genocide. Nothing happening today is comparable to that outcome. But the processes that led to the Holocaust, the psychological mechanisms of radicalization, are not unique. They're human. And studying how those processes worked isn't minimizing the Holocaust. It's taking its lessons seriously. The point isn't to say, this is exactly like Nazi Germany. The point is to ask, when we see similar mechanisms at work, hypersensitivity to threat, dehumanization of outgroups, identity fusion with a leader, destruction of family and institutional buffers, what should we learn from history about where those mechanisms can lead? Question 2. What made German youth vulnerable to this indoctrination? Context matters. Germany in the 1930s was a society in crisis. Economic devastation from the Depression, political instability, national humiliation from World War I's aftermath. People who feel their status is under threat, who feel economically insecure, who feel their group has lost its rightful place in the world, these people are more vulnerable to collective narcissistic appeals. The Nazis offered meaning, belonging, purpose, and someone to blame. For young people especially, who are developmentally seeking identity and belonging, this was powerfully seductive. Question 3. What inoculated those who resisted? Not everyone succumbed. Some German youth actively resisted. Groups like the Edelweiss Pirates sabotaged Nazi activities, distributed anti-war graffiti, and in some cases, were executed for their resistance. What made the difference? The research points to strong family bonds that transmitted alternative values, connection to pre-existing communities like religious or social that maintained different narratives, and critical thinking skills that allowed questioning of authority. In other words, protective factors against radicalization include exactly the things the Nazi regime worked hardest to destroy. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. What can we do with this knowledge? Individual actions. 1. Strengthen family as a buffer. The Nazi playbook started by weakening family influence. We counter that by strengthening it. If you have young people in your life, create space for conversations about values, about critical thinking, about questioning authority. Don't let media consumption from any source become the dominant influence. Be present enough that when seductive ideologies come calling, you're already there as an alternative. 2. Teach media literacy and propaganda recognition. The Hitler Youth didn't know they were being propagandized. It felt like truth. Help young people understand how propaganda works, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical skill. When they see content designed to make them feel aggrieved, special, and under attack, teach them to notice the emotional manipulation rather than just the message. 3. Notice the gradual process. Survivors describe radicalization as subtle, gradual, invisible from the inside. Pay attention to shifts over time. Is someone you know becoming increasingly consumed by grievance? Are they interpreting more and more situations as attacks on their group? Are they identifying more strongly with a leader rather than with ideas or principles? These gradual shifts are the early warning signs. Community actions. 4. Maintain alternative communities. The Nazis dissolved or banned competing youth organizations because alternative communities maintained alternative narratives. Support civic organizations, religious communities, hobby groups, any structure that gives people identity and belonging outside of political tribalism. These aren't distractions from politics. They're buffers against radicalization. 5. Document the process. We know about Hitler Youth indoctrination because survivors documented it, often decades later, when they finally understood what had been done to them. Document what's happening now. Keep records. Write it down. Future generations need to understand how radicalization happened in our era too. The Hitler Youth represents the most systematic documented case of collective narcissism being weaponized at scale. The playbook is known. Exploit existing grievances, cultivate hypersensitivity to threat, frame aggression as defense, instill a sense of racial or national entitlement, and fuse group identity with a charismatic leader. We study this not to call anyone Nazis, but to recognize patterns, to understand that these patterns don't end with genocide. They start somewhere much more ordinary, with feeling special, feeling aggrieved, feeling under attack, and finding a leader who promises to fight for you. In our next episode, we're bringing this home. We'll examine the documented parallels between what we've discussed and what's happening in America right now. No spin, just the research, the evidence, and the patterns. Until then, I'm Sarah, and this is Ethos Trek. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and stay ready to act.